All right. Hello, everybody out there. Welcome to this week's HackSurfer Hangout. This week, we're going to be talking about the World Cup and kind of all the sort of hacking and cybercrime around both the World Cup and kind of big events like that, hacktivism in general. Today, we have Dan Holden with us. He is the director of Arbor Network's Security Engineering and Response Team. How you doing today, Dan?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, I guess just some people might not really be familiar with you or Arbor Networks. You can kind of maybe explain kind of your relationship to the World Cup and big events like these.
Yeah, sure. Arbor Networks is a network visibility and security company. We're fairly well known for DDoS mitigation. We've got a large customer base of the world's internet service providers and enterprises related to big events like World Cup. So things like the Sochi Olympics or the Olympics when they were in London, F1 races, World Cup events, right? Anything that's really large and likely going to have some kind of geopolitical uproar, around it. Many times there's a DDoS threat related to those. So, for instance, anytime there's an election around the world, there's DDoS generally involved. So, we help with both defense and security intelligence to these internet service providers, the enterprises that are responsible for hosting these sites, even the partners of the World Cup, sponsors, so it can be very far-reaching. So we are certainly there to help with defense and, of course, intelligence as to what the threat might be or what the chance of an attack might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I thought that was kind of funny. Just the other day, someone had taken a picture of the World Cup security kind of headquarters, and in the background, right on the monitor, it had their Wi-Fi password, and I guess it got retweeted. I think like almost 3,000 times now, that picture. And looking back on the Super Bowl, I think the exact same thing happened. I think it was CBS hosted the Super Bowl. It was the same thing. It was a picture taken, sort of like inside the booth, and it had the Wi-Fi password and everything right there. Just kind of curious why you think silly things like that happen at such large events like this. It's just kind of interesting it happened twice, the same thing.
Well, it's funny. I was just thinking, there's that Twitter feed that tracks all of the pictures of people posting photos of their new credit cards. So maybe there should be a Twitter feed posting all of the Wi-Fi passwords that people mistakenly post. It's I think just very reflective of the fact that security is a mindset, not just a technology, issue. So, people do all sorts of silly things, and sometimes it is frankly stupidity, and sometimes it's just a silly mistake or not thinking about it. But I think that's actually one of the reasons why you see so many people in the security industry that have been around for so long or stick with security, is because it is very much a mindset. You do need to be paranoid, and that paranoia generally serves you very well in this industry. And if you come into it, regardless of whether you're a part of the security industry or whether you're practicing security, at an enterprise or an ISP or whatever the government, whatever the case might be, if you don't have that level of healthy paranoia, you better get it quick, because it's little slip-ups like that. Just like in so many areas of life that can cost you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a quick note for everyone who was watching out there. If you do have any questions and you want to go ahead and either put them in the Q&A app on Google, or you can tweet them. I got my Twitter handle right on the screen. We'll try to get to them. We do have one question here from Twitter, from @SVPRSweetheart. She wants to know if they're seeing a lot of scams now, as compared to the last World Cup, or if there's any kind of new security threats, emerging, kind of related to big events like these.
That's a really good question, because normally you do see those sorts of things. I mean, any big event, you're going to see some kind of scam. You actually see it all the time with celebrity deaths or weather disasters. You'll get tons of spam and phishing type emails, saying, oh, you can watch the news here, or help the cause, donate money, that sort of activity. I personally haven't seen anything really big around this event that I would say is abnormal or different compared to others. Um, we'll see if that changes, because certainly it's been a very popular World Cup. So certainly cyber criminals are going to pick up on that. The larger the market, the larger the audience, the better for them. So I would not be surprised if it does get worse or we do see something a bit more original. But nothing kind of sticks out in my mind thus far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess, with big events like this, it seems like it's typically you get, well, especially with the World Cup, there's a lot of, what is it, App Hacking Cup, I think it is, the anonymous operation. I think they took down the website last week, the official website. But I guess just in my mind, I don't really take hacktivism too seriously. I don't know if that's sort of a bad thing on my part. I kind of hear, about Anonymous or the Syrian Electronic Army.
It's only bad if you upset them. That's when it's bad.
Yeah, I guess, that's kind of my question is, is that like, should I be taking it more seriously when I kind of see things like that in the news? Because I kind of tend to just sort of brush it off like, oh, just another Twitter hijack or website defacement.
Well, I think the big change, if you look at Anonymous in 2014 versus 2010, 2011, it's turned into much more of a geo-disparate type of organization. So it's rare that you can get all of Anonymous together behind one cause at this point. So, back in 2010, all of Anonymous came together for the WikiLeaks issue and Operation Payback. Quite frankly, I think most people also believe that you had, a lot of the original, more technical members involved as well. At the same time, now you've got Anonymous that is way larger than it was. You've got also a lot of easier tools and better ways to communicate than they probably did 4 years ago. But I think what we generally see in these sorts of operations is that it is very localized. You see Op USA. Well, how many Anonymous members are in USA and don't see any point in attacking, their own own country or own infrastructure? Or you see, Op Israel. Or you see something around, the World Cup. Well, I'm sure there's a bunch of anonymous people that love the World Cup, right? So I think it's not as unified as it once was, and so all of these various operations that they have are going to see varying levels of success, depending on how many and who they have backing it up. So it's the threat is always there. Certainly, if anyone cares enough, quite frankly. There is a serious threat there, whether that's anonymous or, just a cyber criminal or a nation state. I think that's always the question you have to ask is, what is the potential? Quite frankly, over the last couple of years, the potential of anonymous has not been what it was, once was. At the same time, they are successful in some cases, right? They were successful in this case, taking down the World Cup website. They are successful in many countries during elections. So it just kind of depends, again, on what the backing is, how big the event is, how important it is, and how many of their members, care to get behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of looking at, other kind of cybercrime, I would just imagine, when there's a big focus on something, whether it's Super Bowl or an F1 race or, anything like that, that there's, typically some kind of fraud, kind of criminals are sort of going after. I mean, in the news, we always see a lot of stuff about hacktivism, but I'm just wondering if there's any, I don't know, trends or kind of things that you've seen in like the past big events where like more traditional kind of cyber criminals are kind of using tactics to try to make money or things like that besides just protest?
As it relates to what, just DDoS or?
Well, just in general, I just imagine, take the Olympics, it's just a worldwide event. Obviously people are protesting over it, but I also, I'm just thinking that there's got to be a lot of opportunity there just with all the people to do some kind of shenanigans, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. It actually, I think, our question just a moment ago is the perfect example of that. So yeah, the answer is certainly yes. With the really big events, I think it's actually more difficult for Anonymous to be able to successfully pull these things off because it does take more technical acumen, that many of the new Anonymous members don't have, right? So, to pull off a big reflection amplification attack that we've seen, over the last year become more popular. That is not incredibly difficult, but it's also not, just point and click either. Certainly, cyber criminals, as the question earlier mentioned, you're going to have phishing and spam scams related to any kind of event, especially when you're dealing with the Olympics. So, it's a worldwide event, and so you have a worldwide audience. From a cyber criminal standpoint, that's absolutely huge, right? They're always looking for the largest market potential news that is going to be global rather than regional. So, for instance, a couple years ago, now 5 years ago, when Michael Jackson died, right? That was much more of a global event than, let's say, the typical U.S. celebrity might be. And so cyber criminals immediately took advantage of that, posting all sorts of various things, sending emails. You had people, selling T-shirts at the funeral, for God's sake. So people can react pretty quickly to those kinds of news events and, put something together. As long as they've got an audience, and there's a market for that criminal aspect, yeah, I think any of these events are susceptible to both the cybercrime and the hacktivist aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have one question out there from Eric. He wants to know, I don't know if you saw the news story, I think it was just today or the other day, they're just kind of talking about using big data in terms of sporting events. I think I saw something where it said, I think like one soccer club was recording 60 million, player movements and things, per match in order to try to improve their team or whatever using big data.
All right.
So we were kind of chatting about, how kind of the Patriots in the past had been stealing, data or by filming them. Just kind of an interesting question. I'm wondering, like, if looking forward, you kind of see, he wants to know, is there any indication of competitive spying or attacks between teams? I'm kind of in that vein, as a lot more things go cyber. I don't know if you really know anything about that, or just want to speculate on it a little bit.
Well, no. I mean, as you and I were joking earlier, I wonder how many, biting events they've recorded during that time, or how many, trips or falls or that sort of thing. So, big data is like any other type of data analytics, whether it's big or otherwise, whatever you want to call it. Spotting those trends is always interesting. I always think about it kind of like that great book, Freakonomics. It's the issue of trying to find something perhaps that you didn't expect. I think what people get caught into is you find a pattern maybe once, and then you start tracking that pattern again and again and again. If you look at so many of the industry reports that come out from the security industry, we track metrics and don't really question whether the metrics mean so much. Same type of thing with, I think, whether you're talking about sports or whether you're talking about security, right? Look at how much logging we do in this industry. There are SIMs deployed all over the U.S. government that do nothing but log and keep logs for, 7 years, and they're, shoved off on drives and in some closet. That's great, but I think from a defensive posture standpoint, why are we doing that, and what are you getting out of it? And I think people are starting to ask those questions more and more about security. Probably the same thing, with sports, right? People watch, film. Matter of fact, you watch Peyton Manning every time he plays. Always looking at the photos and trying to figure out what went right, what went wrong. Maybe it's a little bit easier with sporting events than it is security. I don't know. We'll have to see how this pans out. But it is an interesting use case with the World Cup because you have so many different teams involved. It's a pretty big event. You've got a lot of different players from around the world. So I think it's actually a pretty interesting use case from that standpoint. I mean, you've got a bigger data set than you would with, say, perhaps a more regional or country type sport like the NFL or anything else. I think actually NASCAR would be a pretty interesting sport because you've got a ton of races, a ton of cars, a ton of accidents. That would have a lot of interesting data perhaps. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see whether that use case catches on and they find anything interesting. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. One thing I kind of wanted to ask you about is just sort of from like the cybersecurity perspective, when there's a big event like the World Cup, maybe if you could just describe a little bit like what goes all into that. Is it a huge operation with a lot of companies or is it just a few companies? Just kind of curious overall kind of how you go about protecting something like that.
That is an excellent question. There's quite a few companies involved, and it's up to the organizations operating it to balance all of that. So, for instance, we're certainly not the only company involved with DDoS defense that's also involved with the World Cup. I'm sure there are certainly other companies involved. There's also tons of companies involved with security overall, right? You're going to have physical security there, and you're going to have all sorts of security related to the website, data, the folks coming in and out. So yeah, it's a lot of various companies and a lot to organize. I can tell you from our standpoint, with the relationship we have with service providers or enterprises that might be related to it, it's a lot of preparation. Obviously, that's where you spend so much of your energy. It's preparing for the worst, and of course, hoping it doesn't. And so a lot of that is just the typical people and process. And then more and more, I think the intelligence aspect, that seems to be the big buzzword of the industry over the last year or whatever. That is becoming more important, right? The more you know, the better off you can potentially be. And I think that's actually helping, though. I mean, that's the nice thing about Anonymous is they tend to advertise what they're doing beforehand. Even with a lot of these, whether it's Anonymous or other types of hacktivism, right? These things are generally posted on Twitter or IRC or on Pastebin, and tracking that sort of thing is become increasingly important. So that I think that helps, knowing what you're up against. From our standpoint, we do a lot of botnet tracking, so we can know that say an attack's going to happen, either before or as it's starting, rather than having to react to it. We track a lot of not only DDoS but financial fraud, APT type activity, geopolitical activity, right? Anything that's kind of campaign based, we're very interested in, and it's wise to of course be out in front of that thing rather than having to react to it. So I'd say Olympics, World Cup, those are really big events, and I'm sure that there's a ton of resources spent not only from the folks putting on the event, but of course all the partners related to it. So it's a pretty big effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just kind of talking about hacktivism a little bit. It seems, from my perspective, that over the last, I'd say, they say take 2013, it was sort of one of the bigger years for a lot of things, whether it was retail breaches or, Edward Snowden was a big example. Everyone just kind of talks about how everything's sort of growing and getting bigger. Wondering if you kind of agree with that in hacktivism, because it seems like, a lot of times people talk about sort of the heyday a couple of years ago when they were, like you brought up earlier, when they were, I guess Anonymous was more of one unit, and now they're kind of broken up. So just in terms of that, do you see that kind of trending sort of the same way, where we're, it's a lot more activity and a lot more things happening, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, I think there certainly was a heyday. I mean, anybody that watches the Anonymous movie is, I think, impressed with the movement that came up and how big they were able to become and how impactful they were. It was impressive. But you had the breakup of LulzSec. You had a lot of these guys get caught, potentially go to prison. So I think that might have scared off some folks. Especially from doing kind of the big takedowns. You've also got an issue of technical acumen. I think the goal of Anonymous wasn't necessarily to be a big group of hackers or attackers. It was to have a big movement, and I think that's attractive to a much broader group of people than just folks that have the technical acumen. And I think they accomplished that goal. At the same time, yes, it certainly watered down their capability, but it made them a larger potential global threat. And I think the issue is, of course, now anybody can claim they're anonymous, and I think, as I said earlier, it really takes someone to care. You really have to put the effort forth to make a big deal, to make a big impact these days, right? Taking down, the World Cup site the other day, that was no small feat. Like I said, that was not just a bunch of point and click type of activity. So um, yeah, I think the heyday was certainly, back in 2010, 2011. But it's not like Anonymous was ever or is the only threat out there, right? So last couple of years we've had huge reflection amplification attacks. I think the retail breaches are huge. I mean, if you look at security spend, certainly governments and financial spend tons of money on security, but I think retail, over the years has been more concerned with things like PCI, and they're having to learn some very hard lessons right now. That is, the compliance zombies are not only the only threat to their business. Target, I think, was a really big wake-up call because, yeah, you go back all those years to TJX and all the events that have happened, whether you're talking Neiman Marcus or P.F. Chang's, these companies are continuing to get hit. I think they likely will continue, right? The cyber criminals have figured out they don't have to come after you and I at home and our credit cards. They can go right to the source where we're spending our money, and that's just broadened the market for them. So I think we can continue to see that. Certainly you've got the privacy concerns, as you mentioned, whether it's Snowden or otherwise. That's always going to be there, I think. And that's always really good debate. Again, going back to that, the state of paranoia is probably a healthy thing. So I would say that, yeah, things aren't necessarily getting, people can say things aren't getting better. I don't know that it's better or worse. I think what's happening, of course, is there's new and different things, right? And we can expect that every year. If you had asked me late last year what was going to be the DDoS trend of 2014, I wouldn't have said NTP. It just probably wouldn't have come to mind. But then, of course, January hits and we've got massive NTP attacks. So that's probably why everybody is sick of those silly predictions every year, is they're almost always wrong. Or they're so generic it doesn't even matter.
Talking about DDoS, one of the trends that I guess we've kind of seen recently is just a lot of extortion around DDoS, at least in the media. It seems, to me, just kind of looking at all the news articles, like it's something that's on the rise. But I don't know if it's just on the rise, just in terms of the media kind of and companies talking about it more, or if it's just something that's sort of always been there. Do you just have any kind of thoughts in general on that?
Yeah. It used to be really popular with gambling sites. So the extortionists, would go after a gambling site, and of course the gambling site makes all its revenue based on its web page, can't afford for that to go down. And the dollar amounts were something they could handle. 10 grand, 15 grand is a lot of money, but compared to the lost revenue and not knowing, necessarily how to defend or how long they'd have to defend, a lot of, those sites paid up. And of course, a lot of those sites were potentially sketchy to begin with. So they figured, well, better to, deal with our own kind perhaps than, spend the money on defense. Because of course, the defense is not necessarily always easy or cheap either. So, and we heard from some folks like that, but the problem was, of course, they paid up and they paid up again, and like, rent from a bad landlord, it just kept going up, and eventually you get tired of it. And so I think more and more those kinds of opportunities dried up, and the maturation overall of just DDoS services and the DDoS underground has really empowered a lot of folks to look at extortion as a possible revenue stream, and it's a big one, right? It's not like taking a bunch of small dollar amounts and pulling it together, right? It's more like a bank heist where you get the big payoff. So yeah, it's always been there, but at the same time, the going after more legitimate businesses is a bit of a growing trend, and I think to your point, what's really happened is these companies going public about it. That's what's really helped. The companies going public, admitting to their customers, the media, that this is what's happened, and we're dealing with it. That openness, I think, is really big and always helps. If you go back to, Google coming out about Project Aurora, back in 2010, that really helped, I think, open the door for more folks to start talking about APT type of activity. Same situation here. I think the more open and honest you are, the more you share. Yeah, it's potentially embarrassing at first, but honestly, the education is huge. For people to learn that they're not the only ones, and that these things become more public is really a big deal. So, it's good that the media covers it. It's good that, of course, people are coming forth and talking about it. And you actually had a company recently that actually went out of business because of it, which I think was incredibly sad. They didn't pay up, and after they didn't, it went a step further past the DDoS, and then they got all of their data, right? So it's people definitely need to understand that DDoS is not a separate thing. It's not just a networking problem. It's not just a lone threat out there by itself. It is many times now an application level issue, and many times also tied to a larger threat or campaign. So it's not, not the old days when we were young and people were doing sin floods and Smurf. It's way past that now.
Yeah, just sort of following up on that, we kind of mentioned a few things about, sort of law enforcement cracking down and, kind of more sort of media, kind of high profile stuff. One of the things recently was just, kind of the FBI sort of cracking down kind of globally. They accused, those some people over in China, and then they did a lot of different raids, I think, like on Black POS and Crypto Locker, things like that. I was just wondering if you kind of followed that at all, and if you kind of have any thoughts on just sort of the U.S. kind of sort of taking that more sort of aggressive stance of, we're going to try to prosecute and basically do everything we can.
Yeah. I don't. You're talking about the old days. I don't relish the idea, that we had in the 90s of the FBI kicking down your door, and that certainly happened. Like the silly hackers movie. I don't want that to necessarily be the case. But it's also a completely different environment than it was in the 90s. Back then it was, I would like to think, far less malicious and more just kids trying to learn and that sort of thing. And of course, law enforcement not knowing what was what, right? I mean, I think that was the main problem of law enforcement's involvement in the past, was not knowing what any of it meant, not understanding that this particular issue was a threat and that issue over there wasn't. Today, right, the knowledge is there, the investment is there. The majority of APT notifications now come probably from the FBI. So I would, and I hate admitting this, right, but I have probably a lot more confidence in law enforcement, today than I would have, years ago. And so, matter of fact, there's a big DHS meeting today related to DDoS, and that's probably a reflection of, the big bank attacks that happened, going back a year and a half or whatever it was. So it's like typical government, right? It's very reactive and it's very slow. But I do feel as though things have gotten better. The information sharing is better. The one thing I would say that is very positive, and I think really nice, is that there's a lot more information sharing now between government, law enforcement, back to the private sector. That, I think, is really big. Where it used to be, right, they kept everything very close to the vest and didn't tell you anything. Now they're very open and want to share that information. I think that's got to be one of the biggest wins, is just the public and private sector actually helping each other out for the greater good. Whereas it was very kind of super secret squirrel, years ago, and I don't think that helped anybody. Especially when you've got government and law enforcement that don't really have a clue and aren't opening up to learn. So we've come a long way, I think, on all fronts. So, I've got a lot more confidence in law enforcement's capability in this day and age, and they're seeing success. It's difficult when you're talking about a global entity, whether you're talking cybercrime or a group like Anonymous. That really slows things down. But domestically, I think they've certainly got the chance and ability to take these guys down. And you're seeing other countries get far more involved now. You see Canada, even sometimes in Europe, where most of this type of activity is a little bit more lenient. You're seeing a lot more arrests so we'll see, right? Nothing's perfect. We have had issues like Aaron Schwartz that is unfortunate, right? And so everybody's got a different opinion. I don't know that I fall on one side of the fence about every single little issue, but I would say that in general it's probably gotten a hell of a lot better, just because of the level of investment and the knowledge on all fronts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're getting close to the end here. I just really wanted to quick touch on, you kind of brought up Ukraine earlier. I know we talked a lot about, sort of the World Cup and the Olympics, but there's a lot of other kind of big events in terms of hacktivism out there and protests and things like that. Just wondering, it's kind of been in the news a lot lately, if you have any just kind of thoughts or things kind of around, Ukraine and sort of what's been going on over there.
Fairly typical, I think, over, the kind of modern threat landscape era, if you will. I mean, geopolitical events are going to have a lot of attack activity, DDoS activity. So I think, obviously everyone always points back to Estonia and Georgia back in 07, 08 as kind of the start of that, and we've seen it ever since. Like I mentioned earlier, right? Every time there's a political election around the world, there's DDoS activity, right? So it's actually one of the reasons why we partnered with Google on the digital attack map. So there's a site that we did together called digitalattackmap.com. And the idea was to highlight and be able for the public at large to be able to see DDoS attacks around the world that might be tied to geopolitical strife. And so, I think it's, unfortunately it is typical. You're going to see a lot of this kind of activity, regardless of whether it's, what it is. I mean, even, year and a half ago when there was issues in Israel, you could see tons of scanning and, activity, targeted towards Israel during that period of time. So, I think there's less naivete at this point around attacker activity or even nation-state activity during these geopolitical issues. So, it's definitely for real, and it should definitely be expected.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, we're just about out of time, so just one final question. Basically, on HackSurfer, we kind of do sort of a question of the month thing, and what we're trying to kind of highlight this month is encryption. It's sort of been a year since Edward Snowden kind of, I guess, came out and released all those documents, and over that past year, everyone's sort of been talking about encryption, and he's been talking about how encryption still works, and it's sort of the answer, and so just trying to get some general thoughts from different cybersecurity people on encryption, and if they do think it's the answer to sort of a lot of problems.
Well, I'm maybe in the minority. Maybe it's the fact that I'm bad at math, but I've never been a huge encryption guy. Obviously, it's very important. It's been around for a very long time. I tend to be a little bit more threat-centric. I think I would point at access control just as much, if not more, than encryption in the case of Snowden. I think if you look at any of the big data breaches, very few of them have anything to do with encryption. I think there's a lot of assumptions on the enterprises trying to defend against these attacks that if they encrypt everything, somehow magically it all becomes secure, and that's not the case. SSL many times can cause problems as much as it solves them. Personal encryption, I think, of course, is phenomenal, right? I mean, going back to when PGP came out, and the fact that it's very easy and simple and doesn't affect performance like it did years and years ago with personal encryption in terms of our own hard drives. That's fantastic. But I don't think there's any huge opportunity for encryption to plug a gap, and there's some massive education that needs to happen around encryption, right? I think encryption is one of those tried and true things that we're all aware of. It's heavily used. Could it be used more? Certainly, perhaps. But I think its use should be alongside other aspects, right? Access control is probably just as important, right? Understanding the threats, what you're protecting, right? It should be more of an asset view, I think, than a encrypt it all. Right? You have to understand what you're protecting and what has access to it and what the threat against that might be. It's just not as simplistic as encrypt it all and then sort it out later.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks for stopping by. We appreciate all your thoughts.
Appreciate it, Jeff. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Well, we'll talk to all you guys again next week and every Thursday throughout the summer. Have a good weekend, everybody.